It was 2:47 a.m. in the emergency room, and the lights were too bright for anyone to feel calm. A man lay on the hospital bed, gasping for breath. Sweat ran down his face. His hands clutched his chest, then his stomach. "It hurts," he whispered. "It's tearing ... inside." The machines around him beeped faster. A nurse nearby called out for vitals. Shoes squeaked across the floor. The cold smell of antiseptic filled the air. Everything was moving fast, but one person, an older black nurse, stood perfectly still. She watched the man, her eyes sharp, her breath slow. Something wasn't right. Not just the pain in his chest. It was how he gripped his sides, how his voice shook, how his blood pressure kept climbing no matter what they did. She'd seen this before, but no one was listening to her. The doctor on shift was young, confident, and sure of himself. He glanced at the man and called it a heart problem. "Textbook case," he said. "Let's start treatment." The nurse stepped forward. "Doctor," she said carefully, "his pain isn't just in the chest. It's in the stomach too, and the pattern doesn't look like a normal heart attack." The doctor smiled politely. "Thank you, nurse, but this is a clear cardiac case." She said nothing for a moment, but inside, she remembered. A few years ago, a man came in with pain like this. The doctor had ignored her then too. That man didn't make it. She'd silent once. She wasn't going to do it again. The patient's name was Leon. He was 42. A construction worker, strong and tough, but right now, he looked scared like a child. He tried to sit up, but couldn't. "Please," he said, his voice shaking. "This doesn't feel like my heart. It's like something's ripping me open." The nurse leaned close. "We're going to figure this out, okay?" She told him softly. "You just hold on." But the doctor wasn't changing course. He ordered aspirin. He asked for an EKG. The team moved fast, following instructions. The nurse felt the weight in her chest grow heavier. She looked at the monitor again. Blood pressure, 190 over 105. No, that wasn't right. It was climbing too fast. And his pulse, it wasn't steady. It was jumping. She stepped closer to the doctor. "We should consider another possibility," she said quietly. "A tear in the aorta. It can feel like this. I've seen it before." The doctor's smile faded just a bit. "That's rare," he said flatly. "Let's not chase wild ideas. This is cardiac. Let's stay on track." The nurse wanted to scream, but she kept her voice steady. "He's not presenting like cardiac. We need to scan his chest. Just to be sure." But the doctor turned away. "Continue with the treatment." The room grew quieter. The young nurse by the wall looked unsure. A paramedic who'd brought Leon in stood stiffly by the door, arms crossed, watching. The nurse could feel the silence, the kind that wraps around your throat. When no one wants to speak up, she looked back at Leon. His breathing was getting worse. His eyes fluttered. He was slipping fast. She had a choice. She could stay quiet, follow the rules, respect the system. But what would happen to Leon? Or she could act, speak louder, risk everything, and maybe save him. Her hands trembled slightly as she took a step forward. "Doctor," she said firmly, "this is not just a heart issue. I believe this man is experiencing an aortic dissection. If we delay, he may not survive." The doctor turned, his voice tight. "Nurse, that's enough," but she didn't move. She knew the risk. She knew what this might cost her. But she also knew what she saw. The fear in Leon's eyes. The pain. The signs that didn't match. She looked at the younger nurse and said calmly, "Prepare a CT scan now." Everyone froze. The doctor's eyes narrowed. "You're overstepping." But then Leon cried out. Loud. The monitor screamed. His pressure shot higher. The room changed in a second. Now, everyone looked at her. And she didn't back down. Not this time. The room didn't move right away. Everyone seemed frozen, caught between the shouting monitor and the nurse's quiet command. Leon groaned again, and this time his hands curled into fists, one clutching his chest, the other gripping the sheets like he was holding on for life itself. The black nurse's voice hadn't been loud, but it had been clear. "Prepare the CT scan," she had said, steady and calm. Not a question. A decision. A younger nurse, standing at the back, glanced between the nurse and the doctor. She looked nervous, unsure. Her hand hovered near the phone. The doctor spoke again, his voice sharper now. "You don't have the authority to order tests, nurse. I gave a clear diagnosis. We are not wasting time chasing rare cases. Prepare the cardiac unit. That's final." But the black nurse didn't step back. Instead, she looked at the younger nurse and said again, this time slower, "Call radiology. Emergency chest scan. Possible aortic dissection." There was silence, except for Leon's ragged breathing and the alarm blaring on his monitor. The younger nurse hesitated, looked at Leon, then at the floor, and picked up the phone. The doctor's. Jaw tensed. "You've crossed a line," he muttered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. But the black nurse had already crossed that line in her mind minutes ago. And now, in her heart, she had crossed it for good. She had seen this before once. Years back. The same look, the same signs. That patient had died on her shift. No one had listened. No one had acted. But she had never forgotten. That night had changed her. It had made her promise herself that if she ever saw it again, she would. Speak up, no matter what it cost her. Now here she was. Same pain, same fear. Same silence from those who thought they knew better. The paramedic from earlier stood in the corner. He finally spoke. He was doing overhead lifting today, heavy beams, holding them up for long periods. The nurse turned to him quickly. "What kind of lifting?" "Arms high. A lot of strain." Same job site all day. Her breath caught in her throat. That was it. That was the missing piece. She stepped forward again, facing the doctor directly. "Doctor," she said, not as a challenge, but as someone who knew what was coming. "This man is showing classic signs of aortic dissection. Chest pain. Tearing. Sensation. Abdominal involvement. Rapid pulse. High blood pressure. And he's been doing work known to cause this kind of strain." The doctor didn't answer right away. He looked at the monitor, then at Leon, who was barely conscious now. Then he looked around the room at the staff who weren't moving. At the young nurse on the phone. At the paramedic with his arms crossed. "You're not in charge here," he said finally, voice lower. "We follow protocol," she nodded once. "And protocol says when a nurse believes a patient is at risk, she can request an emergency second opinion. That's what I'm doing. I'm invoking the policy." The door to the hallway opened again, and another figure entered, a senior physician with gray hair and a clipboard tucked under one arm. The head of the emergency department, the black nurse, turned to him without hesitation. "Doctor," she said, "I need your help. I believe this man is having an aortic dissection. We're treating it as cardiac, but the signs don't fit. He's deteriorating fast." The older doctor looked at her, then looked at Leon, then at the monitor. His face changed. "What have we done so far?" he asked. "Cardiac meds," the attending doctor replied, still standing stiff. "Let's not waste time," the older doctor said. "Get into CT immediately. Page vascular surgery and have them on standby." The room exploded into motion. Suddenly, everyone was moving again. The young nurse lowered the phone and grabbed gloves. The paramedic helped wheel the bed. The doctor who'd pushed back said nothing as the head physician took over the case, but the black nurse didn't celebrate. She stood quietly, watching Leon being rushed out. Her hands were steady, but her heart was racing. She didn't want to be right. She just wanted Leon to live. And if that meant standing alone against a system that had ignored her too many times, then so be it. They wheeled Leon down the hallway, his monitors still beeping wildly. The fluorescent lights above flickered past like flashes of time they didn't have. The nurse walked beside the stretcher, her steps even, her eyes focused. Inside, though, everything was twisting. She had pushed the limit. And now everything depended on whether she'd been right. The head physician, The one with silver in his hair and tired eyes stayed by Leon's side too. He didn't speak much, he didn't need to. His presence alone had calmed the room, but the tension hadn't left. It had just moved with them. Following like a shadow, they reached radiology. A technician met them at the door, sleepy but alert. Now, he looked at the order, then at the monitor. How long's he been like this? Too long, the nurse said softly. Inside the room, the machine hummed to life. Leon tried to speak, but his mouth was dry, his words slurred. His pain had spread deep into his sides and back. It wasn't a squeezing pressure like a heart attack. It was a tearing, ripping pain that made every breath feel like broken glass. The nurse stood just outside the door, arms folded tight against her chest. She kept thinking about the others watching. The younger nurse, the paramedic, the resident doctor. They had seen everything. They'd heard every word in that room. Would they back her up later? Or would they stay quiet like most people did? The attending doctor still in the E hadn't come along. He had stayed behind, probably fuming, maybe planning a report. Maybe writing her name on a list she didn't want to be on. But she didn't. Care. Not tonight. Not when a man's life was on the line. She stared at the monitor outside the CT room. The numbers didn't lie. Blood pressure still high. Pulse still dancing. His body was screaming louder than any protocol. 15 minutes later, the tech walked out holding the film. His face was pale. I've never seen one like this, he said, almost whispering. The senior doctor grabbed the scan. His eyes moved fast across the image. He didn't speak right away. Then he looked at the nurse. You were right, he said. Type A dissection. It's already moved from his chest down through his abdomen. If we had waited any longer... He didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need him to. He turned to the technician. Page the OR. We need vascular surgery. Ready now? Tell them it's urgent. He doesn't have much time. The nurse nodded and stepped aside. Everything was happening fast now, but not fast enough. Leon was in danger. Every second mattered. As they pushed his stretcher toward the elevators, the nurse glanced at his face. He looked half awake, but his eyes flickered to her. Wasn't my heart, huh? He whispered, barely able to get the words out. She bent close and took his hand. No, it wasn't, but we've got you now. A single tear rolled down his cheek. And then they were gone up to surgery, leaving behind a trail of panic, adrenaline, and unanswered questions. The nurse stood in the hallway, alone for a moment. She wanted to cry, but she didn't. She couldn't, not yet. Instead, she walked back, toward the EA, where the silence had shifted. When she stepped into the unit, it was quiet, but not normal quiet. It was that kind of silence that hangs in the air when something serious has just happened. Not a code blue. Not a loss. Something else. Something that made people think. The younger nurse looked up from the desk. Her eyes were wide, and for the first time, full of something more than fear. They held respect. The paramedic nodded at her as she passed. A slow, deliberate nod that meant he understood what she had done. And then, from the far corner, the resident doctor stood up. She had been quiet the entire time, watching, learning. Now she walked over. Thank you, she said softly. For speaking up, for not stopping. The nurse looked at her. One day you'll be in my shoes, she said, and someone will challenge you. Just remember, it's not always about who's right. It's about saving the person in that bed. The resident nodded slowly. She'd remember. The nurse turned back toward the hallway. She was tired now. Her body ached. Her shift had ended an hour ago, but she stayed anyway, because part of her was still up in that OR room. Hoping, praying, that she hadn't been too. Wait, that Leon would make it. That her voice had been enough. The elevator doors had closed behind Leon, taking him and the surgical team up to the operating floor. But down in the EA, the storm hadn't passed it, had only shifted. The nurse stood at the edge of the hallway, the buzz of fluorescent lights humming above her head. She hadn't moved since the stretcher disappeared. She couldn't not yet. Around her, the EA had returned to something close to normal. Phones rang, monitors beeped. Doors opened and shut. But there was a heaviness in the air, like everyone knew something had just cracked in a system they all worked under. The young nurse came over quietly, offering a bottle of water. I've never seen anyone do that before, she said. Do what? Stand up to a doctor like that. The nurse didn't answer right away. She took the water and sat down slowly on the edge of a chair by the nurse's station. Her legs finally felt the weight of everything they just carried. It's not about standing up, she said after a while. It's about standing with the patient. That's what we're here for. That's what nobody teaches you in school. The younger nurse nodded. She sat down next to her, still holding the phone she had used to call radiology. She looked down at it now, like it was heavier than it had been an hour ago. Do you think he's going to make it? I don't know, the nurse replied, her voice low. But if he doesn't, at least I'll know we tried the right thing. From behind the medication cabinet, the paramedic from earlier leaned out. You didn't just try the right thing, he said. You fought for it. That man's still breathing because of you. The nurse gave a tired smile but didn't speak. She didn't want praise. She didn't need to be the hero. She just needed one thing, to hear that Leon made it. That's all. Across the room, the resident doctor stood by the wall, arms folded. She hadn't said much since the argument broke out earlier, but she hadn't missed a second of it either. Now she stepped forward. There was a moment, she said, when I wanted to speak up too, when you mentioned the dissection. I hesitated. The nurse looked up. Why didn't you? I was afraid of being wrong, of crossing him. You're not the only one, the nurse replied. That fear lives in all of us. But every now and then someone has to walk through it. Not for themselves, but for the person lying on that bed. Just then the doors opened again, and the attending doctor, the one who had ignored her, dismissed her and tried to shut her down, walked back into the ER. He looked different. Now no longer calm, no longer confident. He walked with his head slightly down, his lips pressed into a thin line. His hands weren't in his pockets the way they had been before. They were clenched. He stopped a few feet away from the nurse, but he didn't speak right away. Everyone around seemed to pause again, like they were waiting for another argument. Another showdown, but it didn't come. He looked at her, his voice quiet. I just spoke to Dr. Peterson. He confirmed the diagnosis. The nurse nodded once. Yes. He looked away for a second, then back at her. I didn't see it. I was sure it was cardiac. Every symptom matched. Everything I'd been trained to look for ... was there. Except the one thing that mattered, she said softly. The patient. He swallowed hard. You were right. She stood now, slowly. Not out of pride, not to challenge him. Just because this moment mattered too. I didn't want to be right, she said. I wanted him to live. The doctor looked like he wanted to say more. Maybe defend himself, maybe explain. But instead, he just nodded and walked past her toward his office. His steps were slower than usual. The silence in the room stayed behind him. Later that night, the nurse walked to the family waiting area where Leon's wife had arrived. She was still in her work clothes, her eyes swollen from tears, her hands clutching her phone like it was the only thing keeping her steady. The nurse sat beside her gently. He's in surgery, she said. It's serious, but the team caught it in time. Leon's wife turned and grabbed the nurse's hand without a word. Thank you, she whispered. The nurse looked away, blinking fast. Just keep praying. He's got a fighting chance. Back in the AA, hours passed. She stayed through them all. Even when her shift ended, even when the halls grew quiet again, even when everyone else had gone home. Because sometimes you don't leave when the job is over. You leave when the patient is safe. And Tonight, that wasn't guaranteed. Not yet. The clock on the wall had barely moved, yet it felt like time was crawling. The nurse sat in the corner of the waiting area, the same chair she had picked an hour ago. She hadn't moved. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers laced together, still. In her gloves, she hadn't even taken them off. Across the room, Leon's wife sat hunched over with her head in her hands, her phone vibrating every few minutes with unread messages. She didn't look at them. She just stared at the floor, her lips moving in silent prayer. Every once in a while, a staff member would pass by the window, glance in, and keep walking. The story of what happened in the EA had already started moving. Hospitals carry stories like walls carry sound. Quietly, quickly, completely. The nurse heard footsteps approaching and looked up to see the young nurse from earlier walking toward her with 2 paper cups of coffee. She offered one without saying anything and sat down beside her. "Did you sleep?" the nurse asked softly. The young nurse shook her head. "Couldn't. Kept thinking about it. I didn't know we could do." "That what you did?" "We're allowed to speak," the older nurse said. "Some of us just forget we're allowed." She took the coffee. It was bitter and lukewarm, but it gave her something to focus on. The younger nurse hesitated. "Do you think you'll get in trouble?" "I might," she said, honest as always. But trouble's easier to live with than regret. Silence hung between them for a while. Not awkward, just heavy. Shared. Then the double doors opened. The surgical assistant stepped through first, still wearing his cap, mask around his neck. His scrubs were stained with hours of effort. His eyes searched the room, found the nurse, and gave a single nod. She stood up immediately. Leon's wife stood too, gripping the edge of the chair as if afraid to hear what might come next. "Doctor." "Kim is on his way down," the assistant said. "But he asked me to tell you he made it through the worst of it." Leon's wife gasped, her knees buckling slightly. The nurse stepped forward just in time to steady her. "He's not out of danger," the assistant continued. But the tear was caught in time. If it had gone much further. "Well, it didn't." The nurse felt the breath she didn't realize she'd been holding finally leave her chest. "He's alive," Leon's wife whispered. "Yes," the assistant said with a faint smile. "And resting." Tears rolled down her cheeks. She reached for the nurse again, but this time it was a full embrace. "You saved him," she sobbed. "You ... I don't know what you did or how, but thank you." The nurse didn't answer. She just held her. It wasn't about thanks. It never had been. Across the hospital, whispers turned to conversations. In the break room, the resident doctor replayed the moment she saw the nurse refuse to back down. She saw it, she told 2 interns. She knew it wasn't a heart issue, and she didn't wait for permission to care. One of the interns asked, "Wasn't she scared?" "Of course," she replied. But she was braver than anyone in that room. In the A, the paramedic leaned against the supply cabinet, telling another staffer, "You know what that was? That wasn't defiance. That was experience. Years of it. The kind that can smell death walking in before the machines even beep." Meanwhile, in his office, the attending doctor sat at his desk alone. The reports were all done. The file was closed. But he couldn't stop thinking about the look in the nurse's eyes. Not angry. Not smug. Just ... certain ... she had seen something. He didn't. Worse, she had listened while he had refused to. He glanced at the staff performance board. Her name was there, listed for the next 4 night shifts. He picked up his pen, stared at the list, then put it down without making a single change. Upstairs, Leon was still under sedation. Monitors surrounded him. The surgical team had worked nearly 6 hours to repair the tear and stabilize him. His chest was wrapped, his breathing slow, but steady. A nurse on the IQ shift wrote his vitals on the whiteboard. At the top of the chart in black marker, she wrote, "Early diagnosis saved this patient's life." She didn't need to sign it, everyone already knew who it was. Back in the waiting area, The nurse stood by the window now, watching the city lights blink far outside the glass. She felt tired down to her bones. Her feet ached. Her mind was still racing, but her heart felt calm, because tonight, when it mattered most, she had trusted what she knew, and it had saved a life, by morning. The sun had risen over the city, washing the hospital walls in pale gold. But inside St. Mary's, everything still felt dim. Like the light hadn't reached the corners yet. The nurse hadn't gone home. She sat in the staff lounge, half asleep in a chair with her coat draped over her knees, still in her scrubs from the night before. The coffee in her hand had long gone cold, but she hadn't thrown it away. She just sat quietly, breathing in the silence that came after chaos. Across the room, the young nurse from earlier whispered something to another staffer. Both glanced at her, then looked down again, as if not sure whether to approach or let her rest. It wasn't fear anymore. It was something closer to awe and guilt, because she had spoken, and they hadn't. The nurse finally stood up and stretched, her back aching from the long hours and even longer tension. She walked down the hallway and paused when she saw a group of senior staff gathered near the main desk. The head of the ER, the chief resident, and even the hospital's shift administrator, they were speaking in low voices, but it was clear from their body language, something serious was being discussed. One of them noticed her and gave a small nod. She nodded back, but didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. She already knew what the conversation was about. By late morning, the word had reached most departments, not just about Leon's diagnosis, but about how it was caught, about who caught it, and who nearly missed it. And that's when the real shift began. Not in policy, in people, in the break room. A lab technician shook his head while reading a printed report someone had left near the microwave. "We've been trained to trust titles more than judgment," he said aloud. "That could have killed him." A janitor quietly sweeping the hallway paused near the nurse as she walked by. "He's going to make it?" he asked, eyes wide. "He's stable," she said with a soft smile. "They caught it in time." He exhaled hard, like it was his brother who'd been saved. "I heard what you did," he said. "People are talking. You know that, right?" She nodded once. "Let them talk," because the silence that came before, that silence had been deadly. Downstairs, the resident doctor from that night stood in front of a group of interns. She had called an informal meeting in one of the conference rooms. "No slides, no textbooks, just truth. I need to tell you what I saw," she began, pacing slowly. "I saw a nurse make a call no one else had the courage to make. I saw her read a patient better than anyone in that room. And I saw her risk her job to save him." An intern raised a hand. "Was she right?" "She was more than right," the resident said. "She was the reason he's alive." The room went still. She looked at them one by one. "You're all going to be doctors. You'll have the final say someday. But let me make something clear. Final say doesn't mean only. Say you ignore nurses, techs, or even paramedics, you'll lose more than respect. You might lose a patient." That same morning, the doctor who had dismissed the nurse's diagnosis sat across from the hospital director in a small office upstairs. His tie was loose, his hands folded tight in his lap. His words were careful. "I followed the data. Everything lined up with a cardiac issue." The director nodded. "You weren't wrong to follow the symptoms. But someone else saw what you didn't." "I didn't stop her from speaking," the doctor added. "But you didn't listen either," director replied. "And that could have cost a man his life." There was a long pause. Finally, the doctor said, "I want to request a transfer. I think it's best if I step away from this unit." The director studied him a moment. "Are you running from what happened?" "No," he said. "I'm trying to face it. Somewhere I can start over." The request was approved by the end of the day. By the time the nurse returned to check on Leon that evening, the ICU nurse greeted her with a quiet nod. "He's asking for you." She stepped into the dim room, monitors still blinking softly. Leon was awake now, propped up slightly, eyes tired but steady. "You came," he said. Of course I did. He reached out, fingers trembling. She took his hand. I don't remember everything, he whispered. But I remember you were the only one who believed me. The only one who didn't treat me like I was confused. She smiled gently. You weren't confused. You were just in pain, and pain speaks its own language. He looked at her for a long time, then said something she didn't expect. Why did you fight for me? The question landed deep. She didn't answer right away. Then she said, because. No one fought for the last man who looked like you. And I wasn't going to let that happen again. Tears welled in his eyes. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. 6 months had passed since that night in the emergency room. St. Mary's. Hospitals still ran the same way round-the-clock shifts. Glowing monitors, rushed footsteps echoing through cold hallways, but something in the air had shifted. It was small at first, almost invisible, but steady. The shift had a name. Her name was on everyone's lips. Quietly at first, whispered in corners, mentioned in passing. Did you hear what she did? She saved him, you know? She didn't back down. The black nurse never brought it up. Not once. She didn't seek praise. She never stood in the spotlight. In fact, if you asked her, she'd say she was just doing her job, the same way she always had. But everyone else knew better, because that one night had peeled back the surface of the hospital and shown what was hiding beneath. Rigid hierarchy. Unspoken bias. Voices that weren't being heard. After Leon's recovery, things started to happen. It began with a letter. The hospital administration circulated a new internal policy clearly outlining nurses' rights to request second opinions and consult directly with supervising physicians in life-threatening cases. The memo called it Patient Advocacy Reinforcement Protocol, but staff just called it the Jenkins Clause. Everyone knew where it came from. Next came the training. Workshops were rolled out on collaboration, on unconscious bias, on how to listen across roles. At first, a few senior staff rolled their eyes, but even they couldn't ignore the numbers. Since the change, diagnostic error rates in the EI had dropped. Communication between doctors and nurses had improved. Fewer cases were missed, and every time a nurse stepped forward now, every time someone said, "This doesn't feel right," people actually stopped to listen because they remembered her. One morning. During staff orientation, the resident doctor from that night was invited to speak. She stood in front of a room full of fresh, eager faces in white coats. "I want to tell you a story," she began. She told it all. Not just the symptoms, not just the diagnosis, but the silence, the fear, the courage, and the truth. "You'll be doctors one day," she said, voice steady. "But that doesn't mean you'll always be the smartest person in the room. And it doesn't mean you shouldn't listen. A man is alive today because a nurse trusted what she saw and refused to stay quiet. That's what healthcare is. Not ego, not power, but teamwork." In the back of the room, the black nurse had been asked to attend quietly as a guest. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. At the end, the room gave her a standing ovation. She stood for just a moment, gave a nod, and walked out without a word. That was her way. A few months later, she received a letter in the mail. It was handwritten, smudged slightly, like it had been held too tightly. It was from Leon. He had recovered fully. Back to work. Back to lifting steel and welding beams. But something in him had changed, and he wanted her to know. "I don't understand half of what you did medically," he wrote, "but I understand that you listened to me. You looked at me like I wasn't just another number. You believed me even when someone else didn't. That saved my life. And it changed how I look at the world. Thank you for fighting for me when I couldn't fight for myself." She folded the letter and kept it in her locker. Years passed. The nurse continued her quiet work at St. Mary's. She trained new staff, mentored young nurses, and watched the hospital slowly become a place where everyone's voice mattered just a little more. When she finally retired, the hospital hosted a small ceremony in the break room. Balloons, sheet cake, a table of thank you cards. Nothing flashy, just how she liked it. But near the end, one of the administrators stepped forward and handed her a plaque dot. It was simple wooden, no gold, no spotlight. But carved into it were the words, "Because of you, we listen." She didn't cry. Not there. But that night, when she went home and placed the plaque next to Leon's letter, she sat for a long time without saying a word, because she knew what it all meant. It wasn't about proving a doctor wrong. It wasn't about being remembered. It was about one moment in one night when she refused to stay silent. Because sometimes the most powerful thing in a hospital isn't a scalpel or a degree. It's a voice that dares to speak when no one else will. And sometimes that voice saves a life.